My name is Adrian Lee and I go by KC, and I'm the chair of the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences at the University of Washington. On behalf of the University of Washington, I want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands with the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This week marks the one-year anniversary of the George Floyd's murder. While structural racism has long existed in our profession and at our institutions, this phase of collective consciousness regarding social justice started 1 year ago. Along with other events in the past year, it has afforded us the opportunity to evaluate and implement institutional changes with urgency. In December, at our UW annual Minifee lecture, our speaker and panelists laid out the issues at hand as we confront systemic racism in CSD academic training programs. The overwhelming response from our colleagues prompted us to organize a follow-up event. Having listened to many of my BIPOC colleagues, we decided it would be beneficial for us collectively to first reflect on our journeys in the past year, while considering the challenges and the successes we have all faced. Thanks for being here to join us as we examine how recent events have influenced our beliefs, attitudes, and decision for executing more permanent and sustainable change. As the moderator of this webinar, I have asked each panelist to pre-record a 5-minute video to reflect on what they have learned in the past year. Specifically, here are the 5 questions I posed. What have you learned personally with respect to social justice in the past year? What have you learned about the environment you're in with respect to social justice in the past year? What changes you've made that's been successful in moving us towards social justice? What didn't work, and can you identify why? And finally, how do we keep the momentum going? I would like you to join in this reflection with us and share your thoughts in the chat. But now first, I would like to introduce you to our first panelist, Dr. Amber Franklin. Amber is an associate professor of speech pathology and audiology at Miami University of Ohio. Born in the Caribbean and raised in the cultural mosaic of Toronto, Canada, she has a natural appreciation for the rich tapestry that linguistic and cultural diversity creates in organizations and communities. She's a founding member of the City of Oxford's Police Community Relations and Review Commission. This year, she hopes to extend her community impact with a run for Oxford City Council. Here's her reflection.
Last June, I received an invitation to participate in a DE&I task force. Dear Amber, it's time for change. We must act to address and end systemic racism. It is time for action and true change within our community to achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion. Question: do you remember how you felt when you received your task force invitation? Imagine if 1 year later, some of the task force's recommendations would be implemented. Would you consider the task force to be a success? If 1 month into the task force, 15 students of color quit via an Instagram post titled, "We will not work for free," would you consider the task force to be a success? If, in response to the walkout, an administrator told the community that they must continue working toward change rather than, quote, abandoning and publicly rejecting these efforts if immediate results are not observed, would you be hopeful about the institution's ability to make meaningful change? Participation is one of the principles of social justice. It states that people need expanded opportunities for real participation in the decisions that govern their lives. But participation isn't real if the participants' authentic feelings are silenced. In her book, Eloquent Rage, Dr. Brittany Cooper writes, "My feelings are subject to intense micromanagement." And what she is describing is something Dr. Allison Bailey calls affective smothering. And it happens when people know that their audience doesn't quite have the empathy to understand the anger they're experiencing. Would the 15 students have left the task force if they had confidence in the institution's ability to empathize with their anger? What I have learned in the past year is that feelings cannot be divorced from social justice efforts. Full participation requires full acknowledgement of painful feelings, feelings like grief, sorrow, and anger, words that I used in a letter I wrote to my students last summer. An abbreviated version of that letter titled On Racial Disparities, Truth and Reconciliation, an invitation, was published in ASHA Leader Live. And I was heartened to hear from so many people who accepted the invitation. Giving myself permission to express those feelings publicly and receiving messages of support taught me that showing up authentically is a necessary part of social justice work. But we need to give our students permission to do the same in institutional settings. Last summer, a number of feeds began popping up all over Instagram with titles like Black Ivy Stories and, closer to home, Dear Miami U. Their purpose was to share anonymous stories of discrimination experienced by underrepresented students in higher education. These experiences ranged from microaggressions to overt threats and even physical harm. Here's an example. I'm a Middle Eastern man. I grew a long beard my first semester, freshman year, because it's always been something that is part of my culture. After being called a terrorist, among other racist comments by people in my hall, I haven't had a longer beard on campus since. What we read is a description of an event and its consequences. What we don't see is any reference to the writer's feelings. However, as the Instagram campaign became more organized, the leaders encouraged contributors to describe how the discrimination made them feel. Subsequent stories read more like the following. I remember it was my freshman year after choir rehearsal. Myself and a group of friends who are all Black were walking back to our dorms when a group of white young men yelled out the window, "Go back to Africa, you monkeys." I felt angry. I felt sad. I felt belittled. I did not feel love or honor. Love and honor is Miami's tagline. Frankly, it's too early for me to identify how grassroots efforts like Dear Miami U or institutional task force initiatives will change the environment for faculty or students. But what has worked for me and many students of color is experiencing the catharsis of engaging authentically with our feelings. What doesn't work is institutional smothering of those feelings for the sake of institutional image. What I believe will keep the momentum going is maintaining grace and space for those feelings to emerge in all of their complicated forms as we participate fully in the decisions that govern our lives. To quote Maya Angelou, what I have learned is people will forget what you said and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel.
Thank you, Amber. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Peggy Nelson. Peggy is a professor of audiology in the Department of Speech, Language, Hearing Sciences at the University of Minnesota and was a former chair in her department. She's currently serving as the vice chair of the Committee to Improve Racial Diversity, Inclusivity, the 30 Initiatives in the Acoustical Society of America. Here's her reflection.
Hello, and thanks for asking for this moment of reflection. It's a good thing for each of us to reflect, I think. It's a little intimidating, but I think it could be good for all of us to think back over the last year and see where we are and what decisions we've come to. So thanks for the opportunity to do a moment of that. What have I learned personally during the last year? I think the big lesson is that I learned that I really don't have a lot of time left in my career, in my active years, in order to make a difference in the area of social justice and racial equality. None of us has an infinite amount of time. We all have a finite time, but I've decided that this issue is the important one for this capstone part of my career and what I want to focus on for the rest of my active years. Because of the events of the past year and because of things that I've learned throughout my life, this is the time to focus on this issue. And I hope to keep it up for as long as I'm able to. My own family has a history. My ancestors were Quaker. My recent ancestors were poor, dirt poor, but they were white and they had advantages. My father, for example, had the GI Bill, and because of the GI Bill, he was able to buy a house and go to college. And when I learned that many of his Black comrades in World War II did not have those opportunities, were not offered the same benefits from the GI Bill, that was one thing that just sort of put me over the top, I would say. I've decided that there is a place and a role for white allies. I'm still figuring that out, when to speak up, when not to, but I have a certain amount of privilege and protection. What are they going to do to me? Fire me? So I've decided that I'm going to take advantage of that. What have I learned about my own environment, about social justice? Well, I live in Minneapolis. It's been hard to avoid. It's been hard to ignore what's been going on in this blue state that I live in that's full of very white people. I've learned that I live on the Dakota lands and that the treatment of the Dakota peoples has probably been among the worst injustices of all. But in looking back over the last year, I've thought about white progressives in Minnesota, in this blue state. And we've been involved in immigration and human rights for a long time, but it comes with this paternalistic edge, comes with this colonial missionary sort of edge. You even hear people say, but I'm trying to help you. So we've got to learn how to live in a state of equality where we're supporting one another, when we're not looking down on anyone else and trying to do the right thing. I live right in Minneapolis, in the heart of Minneapolis. The racial disparities here are just unconscionable. And they're in our laws and they're in our neighborhoods. And if you haven't checked out Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota, I recommend that you look at that. And most of all, perhaps right now, we need to do something about policing and justice, and it needs to be drastic. When I go to an event on campus or in the city, I look around, and if I see police, I'm relieved that there's someone keeping the peace. But my colleagues and students of color look around, and when they see police, they're worried, they're concerned. So something is very, very wrong here when the two of us have such different perspectives on the presence of police. We have much in this blue state to do in order to make things really just and really equal. What changes have I made that have been somewhat successful? Well, I talk about racism and injustice all the time now, like all the time. And among the colleagues that are working on things through our professions and in our communities, we acknowledge that we make mistakes because we're going to make mistakes. But we're deciding to act. And we're asking more about what's holding us back than what we should do. And I think we've all decided that we honestly are better in every way, professionally, as a community, economically, socially. We're better in every way if we're more inclusive. And there's nothing then that should hold us back from this. And there's nothing that should hold us back from doing it quickly. What hasn't been working, Casey asked. I think just taking it slow isn't working. Doing what we've been doing, but trying to make incremental changes isn't working. And that includes things to the hiring and promotion in our field. It includes changes to policing. Taking our time and being cautious just perpetuates racism and injustice. And we have to say that out loud, and we have to disrupt what's normal. So we can't take it slow. We can't do it incrementally, I think. I think we have to take bold action, disruptive action, and we have to keep the momentum going even when it feels like we're kind of tired of it. We can't give up. We don't look away for a minute. I think we have to find one another. I look to meet all of you, to find a cohort, to keep me honest, to keep each other honest, to read and to think and to do a little self-reflection, but then to act, to interrupt and to disrupt, especially those of us that have some privilege and some power. A colleague in another profession, not ours, but in a similar profession, a Black colleague, a Black female colleague told me that until the profession needs change, the profession won't change. In other words, the profession is going along fine. There are plenty of speech language pathologists and audiologists. Things are going fine. And as long as things are going fine, the kind of change that we need isn't going to happen. No meaningful change is really going to happen. The profession will be open to people who don't look like me, slightly inclusive, maybe incremental changes, but nothing is really going to change as long as the profession isn't really ready for this active change. It has to be the imperative of the profession. I believe our profession really needs inclusivity and diversity. I think that it is imperative that we become more inclusive in order to thrive as a science and as a clinical field. I think it's not optional, and I look forward to working together. Thanks.
Thank you, Peggy. Next, I would like to introduce you to the newly minted Dr. Teresa Girolamo. She recently graduated from the Child Language Doctoral Program at the University of Kansas under the tutelage of Dr. Mabel Rice. Her interests lie in advancing equity in CSD as well as in higher education research. She works with autistic minority young adults. Teresa is currently a member of the Council for Academic Programs in Communication Sciences and Disorder, CAPSID, DEI committee. Here's her reflection.
Over the past year, I have learned the following about social justice. It is easier for many to show up for discrete events than for systemic racism in everyday contexts. For example, I care about culturally sensitive methods in research. And as the only visible minority in many academic spaces, I have experienced some interesting behavior. Pre-COVID, at weekly research meetings, a group of 3 white peers would regularly make faces at one another, roll their eyes, and mock me whenever I spoke up about cultural responsivity in research. It reached the point where another student actually went and reported this behavior. 2 of the 3 peers are in academia working in child development with marginalized BIPOC populations and have demonstrated similar behavior with other BIPOC students, including some with disabilities. I am afraid of what will happen as they move forward into roles as journal reviewers, lab PIs, advisors, and committee members without accountability mechanisms. Of course, the underlying issue here is that we have a structure and a culture in academia where behavior like this is acceptable. Altogether, we have a long way to go in terms of eradicating racism. I've learned 2 things about the environment I am in with respect to social justice in the past year. First, while I have been fortunate to meet many individuals committed to social justice at my institution, the University of Kansas, the institutional culture just isn't there. Second, from my involvement with professional societies, CAPSID and ASHA, I have learned that many key stakeholders are happy to have productive conversations about social justice. I've realized more than ever the value of saying hello and of leveraging relationships built on mutual interests. In my case, those interests, more often than not, are progressing our field by removing systemic barriers to access and success. One change I have made that has been successful in moving us towards social justice involves institutional advocacy. At KU, I co-founded the Student Equity and Inclusion Work Group to advance minority students in CSD and more broadly in higher education. In addition to affecting anti-racist, institution-wide policy change, we support individual BIPOC students in advancing in CSD. For example, in this past application cycle, we supported 5 students in being admitted to top graduate programs with fellowships and funding, as well as many others in receiving grants and awards. More broadly, we have developed a portable, uniquely situated network that is invested in and well suited to support BIPOC students, both financially and emotionally. One initiative that has yet to work is bringing people along who may not yet want to come along or may not ever want to come along. That is, while I may be open to dialogue about DEI, social justice, and racism, I cannot make anyone else feel the same way if they are not at the right place in their social justice journey. And more broadly, as a student of color with very little power, it is definitely not my job to affect change in administrators or faculty, even though I've had, frankly, some senior white males in the profession suggest that it is my job.
Thank you, Teresa. We now turn to Dr. Charles Ellis Jr. He is a professor and the director of doctoral education in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at East Carolina University. He was recently appointed chair of the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences at University of Florida starting in July 2021. Dr. Ellis is internationally recognized for his clinical outcomes research in the areas of adult neurogenic communication disorders and health disparities. Here's his reflection.
So what have I learned personally with respect to social justice in the past year? I think in my work in health disparities that I have thought about the social determinants, but probably I had not expanded to really understand the political contributions, the political determinants of health, and how those intertwine with the social determinants to impact outcomes related to health, and then specifically how those potentially translate into issues related to neurogenic communication disorders, the area that I'm most interested in. I think I had learned a number of different models and approaches outside of the field, but in the past year, I think I've had to expand even further to figure out how these broader issues impact disorders of communication. What have I learned about the environment where I work? I think I've learned a couple of things, that there are a number of folks who are really interested in addressing these issues. Some who have really thought and looked at the literature to understand, and then others who have had a lot of eagerness and energy, but not necessarily with the background to help those, or to collectively work to get a final solution. I do think there has been a push in some circles to try to get a simple solution to problems that are very complicated in academia and in healthcare, um, to maybe identify um, a checklist of things that we can use to solve this very complicated problem. And I think I have some concern in that area. What changes have I made that have been successful in moving us forward? I think I've spent a lot of time trying to listen to thought leaders, people who have been working in the areas of social justice, not just in the past year, but for the past few decades, to better understand the approaches that they have used to get us to this point, to realize the true impact of social justice issues and how they're related to health and outcomes. And I think I've tried to integrate that in the publications that I've been working on in the past year. I've tried to move outside of the field to find models and explanations that can help us within the field. I think sometimes we try to find the answers in our own literature and within the work in our own field, and we we definitely need to expand beyond our own work to to find the best solutions. So, what are some things that didn't work, and can you identify why? I think even on the publishing side, um, even in my attempts to move to the broader literature, um, there's still folks who are in the field reviewing based on their knowledge of the field. And so when you're trying to integrate information from other disciplines to help move our field forward, you can be limited by those who are that try to emphasize linking to our established literature. And unfortunately, in areas related to social justice, our literature has been limited, and how that might impact um, the outcomes that we're working for. So that probably is an area that that didn't necessarily work, but will work in time. How do we keep it going forward? Just stay focused on it. To make sure that we emphasize that this is a major problem that will not be eliminated with a short-term solution or just a checklist of items.
Thank you, Charles. Now I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Robert Mayo. Robert is a professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and was a former chair in this department. His recent research and works have focused on public perceptions of persons who stutter, health disparities among populations with communication disorders, personnel preparation in CSD, and communication wellness. Here's his reflection on the 5 questions I posed.
What have you learned personally with respect to social justice in the past year? My professional career has spanned across the 1970s to the present day, so I've seen and experienced much. The social justice issues of the past year are confirmation of what I learned long ago, that social justice issues in the profession of CSD come in cycles, like a sine wave or a roller coaster, with some progress followed by major upheavals. The limited representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC in both graduate academic programs and in clinical practice has been a consistent theme over those 4 decades. Another long-standing issue is the misuse of standardized assessment protocols and interpretation of test findings with culturally and linguistically diverse populations. These ebbs and flows of knowledge and commitment to doing better are, from my perspective over the last 40 years, exasperating. So I can fully understand the frustration and pain current students and practitioners feel. Some may call proponents of social justice in our field impatient or angry, much as my generation was labeled many years ago. I would push back on such statements by saying a social justice reckoning in this profession is long overdue. What have you learned about the environment you're in with respect to social justice in the past year? Many institutions across the nation, be they corporations, colleges or universities, professional associations, etc., have written statements of solidarity with BIPOC, affirmations that Black Lives Matter, repudiated the increase in acts of violence against BIPOC, and so forth. Some of these statements will be followed up with explicit and meaningful action by these institutions. For me, meaningful action at my institution would include consistent, successful recruitment, admission, enrollment, and support and graduation of BIPOC students. Meaningful action also comes in the form of ASHA's Council on Academic Accreditation in Audiology and Speech Language Pathologies proposed changes to its standards for graduate programs, wherein, among other changes, new language would be added to reflect the program's accountability in ensuring that all students are afforded opportunities for self-examination and awareness of potential bias. This, in my opinion, is a significant action step on the part of ASHA. What changes have you made that have been successful in moving us towards social justice? Well, at my institution, we have a high school to college initiative that recruits Latinx students and offers summer college preparatory experiences for them. The program has been quite successful overall, and we have increased the number of Latinx undergraduate students choosing to major in CSD based on our involvement and support of this program. What did not work, and can you identify why? I spoke earlier of the cyclic nature of change in our profession. While the CSD program at my institution recruited and admitted BIPOC students to our master's degree program in speech language pathology, none accepted the offer of admission. So we will have a graduate cohort without a single BIPOC student this coming academic year. I mentioned the critical element of supporting such students once they are admitted to a program. The primary reason given by the BIPOC applicants for declining our admission offer was our program's inability to compete with the financial aid offers from other programs around the country. How would you keep the momentum going? Students, faculty, administrators, and clinicians must be educated on concepts of cultural humility and competence and be provided with opportunities to practice these skills. There must also be accountability at all levels, meaning to each other within the profession. We should also require administrators and policymakers to address and fight against legislation and systemic ingrained behaviors that would deny BIPOC students entry into the professions of speech language pathology and audiology.
Thank you, Robert. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to Vicki Deal-Williams. Vicki is the Chief Staff Officer of Multicultural Affairs at American Speech Language Hearing Association, ASHA. She's an ASHA-certified speech language pathologist, as well as a certified association executive who has contributed to strategic conversations about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in associations and nonprofit management, association leadership, and strategic planning. Here's her reflection.
As I reflect back over the last year and think about what I've learned, I think one of the things that stands out for me is how powerful a motivator pain is. I think the collective pain that we've all experienced over the past year, given all of the things that we have had thrown at us, has, I think, moved us to a point where we've all felt like we need to do things, we need to act, we need to respond. And the pain that our members and students have expressed to us in that time frame about what their experiences have been like is real. And I think that it's been motivating us to a level of action that I haven't seen before at ASHA. And I've experienced that pain personally. So for us to get to a point where people are as clear and committed as they are in identifying their needs, describing those needs, wanting to discuss them and ensure that people understand that there is a source of that pain that has not been addressed. And I think that's what I've learned about ASHA in thinking about it. And again, hindsight is 2020. Looking at our approach over the last several decades, we have taken the system that exists and attempted to try to bring people to it, to strengthen them, to build them up, to provide whatever was needed in order for them to participate in those systems and structures without recognizing those systems and structures were the source of the pain. Now we are addressing those sources, and I've learned that ASHA can move a lot faster than we thought, but that there are deeply rooted issues that will take a significant amount of time to address. In terms of what changes we've made as we move forward, I think it's just that. It's trying to figure out how to get to the deeper part of that source of pain and trying to ask different questions and define and determine outcomes, just as the ASHA Board of Directors did in rewriting the Envision Future 2025, to describe what that future scenario looks like in terms of professions that are steeped in equity, that are based on inclusion, where diversity is routine and is the norm. And once we have that future defined, then it's a little bit easier for us to go back from there and figure out what steps need to be taken in order to achieve those items and those outcomes. So I think that we're asking different questions. We are figuring out what the expectations are. And once we know those expectations, we can move forward. I think we have seen very clearly that when we don't pay attention to the fact that those expectations have changed, and they've changed as a result of that pain, people aren't going to give us the grace. They aren't going to give us the benefit of the doubt. They aren't going to recognize that there's work that's been done, because it doesn't matter, because it didn't alleviate the pain at the source. So trying to get to that source, I think, is clearly the focus that we have to have as we continue to move forward. And that momentum, I think, is getting us to sustain that momentum. We have to be solutions focused. We have to look at both short-term and long-term solutions. We have to figure out how we move things forward, offer feedback, give people grace, recognize the things that are intended and the impact. And those have to be aligned. If they aren't, we're not going to be successful.
Thanks, Vicki. At this point, I'd like to ask all panelists to join us by switching on the video cameras, and we'll start our panel discussion. All right. Well, thank you for all of you joining us in this panel. If you don't mind, I'm going to start a question mainly for Amber and Vicki, but please join in and jump in. You both mentioned that grace is needed to do the hard work moving forward, and I agree. But you also identified that the amount of pain people are feeling due to the long existing systemic problems and the failure to acknowledge or address the pain adequately now would result in people losing that good faith and grace that they'll grant us to do this work. Do you think that this mismatch stems from a fundamental difference in viewpoints between the status quo and the oppressed? Or is it primarily a communication barrier between the change agent within the system and the folks who are suffering? And the engineering in me want to sneak in another question. Once we do acknowledge these emotions, how do we move from expressing these feelings to actively and constructively participate in finding solutions to these systemic problems? And how do we as marginalized BIPOCs engaged in this process authentically?
I'll start, Vicki, but I'd like you to jump in, please. I think you asked several questions, so I'll just address a couple of them. One is the idea of how institutions want to see change happen and how change naturally happens. I think sometimes institutions want change to be orderly and predictable. And I think it rarely is. And I think that feelings are also not orderly or predictable. So last summer, I felt anger in ways that I didn't think I was capable of, but it was also motivating. And so I think when you expect things to happen in a really self-contained way, sometimes things come out, sideways. And for the young people in the story that I shared who left the task force, there were a lot of different feelings that the people in the institution had about it. Some people feel like you can't walk away from the table because the table is where change happens. But at the same time, that is a strategy, right? Sometimes showing up, being messy, walking away from the table, it can be where the discussion starts rather than where it ends. And so I think making room for that messiness is an important part of the process. And I'll stop and let Vicki share as well.
No, I think you raise a really good point in terms of that lack of order and that messiness. I think one of the things that's really hard, so many of the individuals who are responsible for making the changes are, I don't want to say out of touch, but there's a lack of alignment with with the impact of those feelings. So there's an assumption that you feel it, you get over it, you move on and you get back to work. And it doesn't necessarily happen that way. So I think that gets at part of one of your questions, Casey. But I think the other thing that occurred to me as you were asking them was, there's another question that comes to mind, and that's, can you be trusted to act in good faith? And I think until we show ourselves worthy, our institutions show ourselves worthy of that trust, then it really doesn't matter, because the pain's still there, the feelings are still there, there isn't going to be order. The problem is we've got to find a way to move people to a point where, okay, we understand this is hard, this is painful. And that to me is where grace comes in. And we can't function without it. We can't function without that forgiveness. We're going to need people to recognize we're going to mess this up. We are imperfect. We are going to make mistakes. We're going to get it wrong. We need people to be able to give us feedback. And I don't know if that burden is one that we can all share. So it's trying to figure out how to do that. That will help move us forward.
Vicki.
Can I put Robert on the spot to follow up on that? Because I hear your exasperation, Robert, with this sine wave of activity. I mean, how does that translate into the pace and the kind of change we should be doing in 2021 and 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vicki hit it right on the spot. Amber also. I mean, there's a definite pain associated with, and I'll just say it, for what it is, the recent social injustices, with all of their cruelty and callousness that makes trust and makes let's do this in an incremental fashion, just almost a non-starter. And I'm thinking particularly about students, and that's the population, that's my frame of reference. It's who I work with most often. And so, I mean, we're really going to have to be about the business of, as was stated, giving grace to the powers that be. But in terms of convincing students about that, I think as adults and professionals, we can do that. We're capable of it. But I think our students at this point, they're angry, they're hurt, and they're not too much on the giving of the grace side of things. But I think, again, it's got to be just like Vicki and Amber said, we've got to roll up the sleeves, get in and do the dirty work that's associated with this in order to make any change, in order to affect any type of change.
Yeah, Robert, I hear the cycle, and actually different people have said different things to me, saying, make sure that as BIPOCs working on this space, that you don't feel hurt yet again when you give it all at every single crest of the cycle. Should BIPOCs give it all this time around and risk getting hurt again?
Yeah, I think we should give it our all in the sense of holding our professional organizations, administrators, faculty accountable. If we aren't willing to do that, and if we tell our students, oh, just wait and things will move along, and we've got to do this sort of the quote right way, unquote, I think we're going to sabotage ourselves. We'll end up being hurt once again. I think it was, and I'll just show you how old I am. It was during the Reagan presidential administration when we were working with, in terms of détente and perestroika, with the then Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan made the statement of trust but verify. And I think that's really where we have to be at this point. If we are willing to put ourselves out there with that naivete that you talked a little bit about earlier in our discussion, Casey, that naivete might be a synonym for hope. And what I think our students are hoping is that our profession loves us as much as they love the profession. And so we're willing to put ourselves out there. But I think this time around, there's got to be a reckoning, and the profession has to prove to us that it's willing to make these changes, make these concessions. Otherwise, we'll be right back where we started in a new cycle.
Well, thank you, Robert. Peggy, I'd like to bring you in. What actionable steps do you think other senior leaders in CSD can do to advance social justice? Have you observed examples of the colonial, missionary, paternalistic mindset in our profession? And just to fold in the discussion raised by our participant, faculties are burned out, especially because of COVID. How do we move forward? And can we ask our faculty to do more in this space?
Well, I'm going to need some help with those answers, but yes, we can ask them to do more. We have to. And maybe COVID is a moment too where we're also looking for what are our core values here. What are we really about here? And maybe they'll go together well. Oh, I see. Ever since I learned from colleagues to look for this paternalistic, missionary, colonial thing, I see it all everywhere. In the forming of committees, of where the faces don't reflect the outcomes that are stated. Charles, I resonated with you, making lists, checklists. That's what I want to do. I want to make another checklist. It's not involving people in decisions at the grassroots. And if we're communication sciences and disorders, and we have to listen with our ears open and with our feet on the ground and figure out maybe even what the questions are, because we probably aren't asking the right questions at this point in time. So I think we need our leadership to stop and breathe for a moment to figure out whether we're asking the right questions and then to dive right in. I don't know the balance between acting fast and acting slow. I just don't want to get into another one of those negative cycles.
Yeah, personally, I'm also seeing there are questions coming in about, how do you, what's the recognition that's needed for faculty to commit to this work? Vicki.
Well, no, I was just going to tack on to Peggy's comment, because I don't know that we're asking faculty to do more. We're asking them to do something else. I don't know that if they keep doing what they've been doing, we're going to end up in the same place we are. And we already know that that's not going to work. So I think we need them, like Peggy said, to ask different questions. What do we expect of students? What does a successful student look like? What is it that, how do we recruit students? How do we get around those things that we know are issues? It's not like they're new. Like Robert said, we've been dealing with these issues for so long. So now that we know what they are, everybody else knows that we know what they are. Let's start to do some of the work to answer those questions, get those answers, because the answers to those questions, once you generate a list, the answers will direct us to what it is that we need to do differently.
Teresa, you have something to add?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I have many observations, I think, from kind of the perspective of being a student, where sometimes you get to see how people act when they don't think anyone important is watching. And that's been probably the most valuable thing throughout my doctoral studies, especially because I came into this field not from CSD. So I didn't have the connections, I didn't know anything about speech language pathology, didn't have the research experience. And so one observation I have is just if we think of, say, someone's entire time in CSD as a lifespan, which should be familiar to many of us. There are many points all along one's lifespan in CSD at which they can be dinged against, right? So oftentimes I will hear things like microaggressions or simply that, but they have additive effects over time. So for example, one thing I think senior leaders in CSD can do to advance social justice is change the culture that we currently have. I think one of the most recent graduates from my lab is now tenured at a minority serving institution, but at least like internally, she's kind of known for having this comment when there were these different candidates who had come to KU to interview for a position. And somebody else asked her, just to be polite, oh, how was so-and-so's job talk? And this person's response was, oh, like shoulder shrug, minority candidate. And so it's just kind of indicative of, I think, kind of the culture that's going on. And that is a place where I think senior leaders, especially those in charge of our professional and scientific organizations, are in a unique position to set the tone from the top down.
Yes, Amber.
I really appreciate what Teresa had to say. And then I was looking at a comment in the chat about how to bring more students into the field and the view on what extra work looks like. So one of the things that we've done here at Miami recently is we used to have a pre-major, which is students had to have a 3.0 GPA after their second year before they were allowed to move on to take junior and senior level classes. And one of the questions I started raising was, is it possible that just having that extra sort of gate in the middle of a 4-year program would deter some qualified students from even attempting our major because they don't want to risk having to, change course midway through? And the other question that we should ask too is, so that the pre-major was there for, ostensibly good reasons, which was grad school is hard to get into. you're probably not going to get in with a 2 anything. So, we want to make sure students aren't graduating with that. But then the question that I have is, first of all, who are we to say what a student can and can't do with the undergraduate degree in our major? Some of our students, and often students of color, we don't have many BIPOC students here at Miami, we're slowly getting more. They don't go into grad school, but not always because their grade isn't high enough, but because they're choosing different paths. And so I'm starting to bring that in where we're talking about alternative career paths with the SPA undergraduate degree. I mean, politics, public policy, public health, nursing. But the other thing is when people talk about, well, it's going to be extra work, right? And, sometimes I find myself spending a lot of time dealing with students who are upset that they got an A- and not an A. And we're all very accustomed to that. People don't see that as extra work necessarily, right? But they'll say, well, if I have to spend extra time working with a student who doesn't understand concepts, that's extra work. And so I do think that that idea of where we put our efforts and who might benefit from those extra efforts can be steeped in implicit bias and systemic racism as well.
And I'll also add that I think we really need to define excellence and award excellence. And we cannot have excellence without diversity. So if we look at this and rewarding our faculty, rewarding our students, that they have to do diversity work as part of the definition of excellence, I think tying to the reward system, that's one way to change the system. I want to pivot to Charles and ask sort of in the publication and reviewers, what's one step you would recommend to put into practice to increase the likelihood that our profession will effectively address health disparities or social determinants of health?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I would probably think about is to get editors and reviewers to give a lot more thought to the folks that they identify to review this work. Because what typically, in my experience, has been that you have great researchers in the field who may have no real background on health disparities or social justice issues, and they're reviewing these manuscripts because maybe the population aligns with their research. That becomes very problematic because the social justice and health disparities literature is governed by an entirely different set of theoretical models for evaluating outcomes. So for example, if a lot of my work is in the area of aphasia, if you get the top aphasiologists to review some of that work, they may have no sense of what it means on the health disparity side or the health services side. So I think editors have to be more strategic in the folks that they identify. I think experts in the field need to be more willing to say, I don't have the expertise in that area. And collectively, we have to understand that this whole process is it's clearly linked to promotion and tenure. So if you have reviewers and editors making the wrong choices and stalling manuscripts, then it has a greater impact on the faculty member. And it tends to be consistently that it's junior faculty members who maybe are not as skilled and experienced with dealing with the review process. Because early on, we think we have to be responsive to everything that the reviewer is saying, and everything that they're saying is right. And that is not the case. But when you're early career, it's hard to know what some of these reviews really mean when we're in the middle of issues that we're not entirely clear on as a profession. So I think that's probably where I would start. And when I mentor junior faculty, I try to invest a lot of time in helping them to interpret reviews. Well, what is this person saying and what does this mean? And what here are several approaches that you might consider.
Thanks, Charles. I just want to acknowledge it's the top of the hour right now. I've asked the panelists whether they can stay for extra few minutes because there are a few questions coming from the audience. And for those that can't join us because they have another commitment, this has been recorded and we'll send you the recording of the panel discussions as well. Let me jump back to Teresa really briefly. First, I want to say out loud, it is that despite what your senior male professor said to you, it is not incumbent on you to change the system. From the chat, I think other students are also finding the experience of microaggression. How did you deal with it? What are the ways to cope?
Okay, so for the first part, I think it's important for students, especially if they're coming from a marginalized background or a multiply marginalized background, thinking about intersectionality theory, right? Where your intersecting identities may give you membership in different marginalized communities. I think the most important thing is to sit down and think about where your boundaries are, right? Because the most important thing is to maintain your peace of mind. And if you do not have that, it can be really frustrating to try and advocate for yourself or for others if you don't get the outcome you want. And the second part is like, don't be afraid to ask people for things, including me. I think a graduate student sent me this question. This will sound awful to everyone out there who's a faculty member, but I thought about it. And I don't really care if I stay in CSD or not, meaning that if I have to be quiet, or if I have to act a certain way, or if I have to hold my tongue, you know, like that's great. I can go do other things with my life. So I think, at least for my circumstance, I haven't been afraid to ask people for things, and it doesn't always work. Like, for example, we just had a manuscript accepted about the work group that I started at KU. And if you look at the acknowledgements page, it will tell you exactly all the administrators at KU that I like and the ones that I don't. And frankly, those have been the ones who have just been really receptive to engaging in dialogue, being called in and thinking about, okay, well, in the great red state of Kansas, where we have to, you know, answer to the Kansas Board of Regents, where are places that we can affect change? You know, they're not going to send things in upheaval. And some of them have been really good at doing this very quietly. So I think as a graduate student, think about where your boundaries are, and then like ask people for things. It may not always work, but you know, like in the off chance that it does, it can be really nice.
This comes back to the conversation I have with Robert. I mean, it sounds like it's naivety, but I think he's identified it's hope. You have to hope that change can be there. And you have to come from that what you have to believe in what you do. And certain type of risks may sound risky. I think it will pay off in the end. But thank you for your courage, Teresa. It is courage. I have sort of distilling two questions in the chat and questions into one question for everyone. There's been a lot of talks lately in the last year. How can we act? And specifically, ramping everyone up in the knowledge in DEI framework for faculty may not necessarily be as easy. Everyone's going through a different journey, but I think we all agree that the students are pretty ahead on their journey than many faculty. How do we better prepare ourselves?
Let me jump in on kind of give a short answer on that one. Faculty either love or hate strategic planning. Can I get an amen on that? Organizations and associations love or hate strategic planning. Well, I would just offer that, you know, an institution should look at this from the framework of a strategic plan. You've got goals, you've got timetables, you've got incentives, rewards, and in some instances, punishments for not reaching the strategic plan. So if we're going to think about this in an organizational fashion, as most universities love to think, let's tackle it from a strategic planning standpoint.
Yeah, I think, and I would just add to that, we have these plans. What tends to happen is that multiple levels of the enterprise or the universities act in different ways and at different times. And so there's not uniform movement. I don't think it always has to align, but there has to be some overarching principles that are grounded in the plan itself. But you have individual people who have a great enthusiasm that might take an approach. Then you might have a department that's interpreting the strategic plan in one way and taking another approach, and then the college is taking an approach, and then the university leadership is communicating something totally different. And so those, you have to get some agreement in those areas as to exactly what we're, or maybe not exactly, but generally what we're trying to accomplish. I think I had a coach that used to tell us all the time to be quick, but not in a hurry. And what he meant was, yeah, we need to be fast because we were a short team. So we needed to be fast in order to compete. But when you're in a hurry, you make mistakes and you don't define things and operationalize things in the right way. And I think in some aspects, we've got to keep the movement going, but we're in a hurry to get to the checklist. And not only are we in a hurry, we operate on and off cycles. And I'm afraid right now we're in an off cycle because we're in the summer and that we'll restart again in the fall. That's a lot of lost opportunity when society in general is still grappling with this issue, when academia in a lot of places is on vacation. So it's tricky, but we do have to be quick, but not in a hurry.
Vicki, you have another question for Charles.
Well, I do, and it follows up on what you just said, that doing nothing perpetuates the current racist situation. So that can't be an option. And I was thinking about that, Charles, when you were talking about the review process and promotion. If I teach my students how to interpret reviews and how to do reviews the way I did them in my parent and grandparent academic parenting, then we're perpetuating the system. I think we also have to disrupt the reviewer side and the promotion side. Could you have you thought about that and how we can also refocus the review process?
Yeah, I would ask this thought, and I would not encourage junior faculty to do this, but it's an approach that I'm using because I'm in the latter stages of my career, that I look outside of the field and I stand my ground on areas that I believe I'm correct and that I am supported by other aspects of the literature. That becomes very problematic for junior faculty because they don't necessarily have the time to go through 4 or 5 different cycles to get the endpoint. But I think those of us who are more senior, where maybe the numbers don't matter in the same way, that we have to approach it as that in this last final phase, whatever that is, that we're going to make a difference, even if the work is not published. And so that has kind of been my attitude with it. And I've refused at least 5 or 6 times this year of drawing a final conclusion and having a checklist in an article that I have published. And that can be hard to do that. Would I have done that in the beginning? Absolutely not. I would have tried to respond to everything that was in the review, and ultimately I would not have been successful, which was the case early on. So I think it's that those of us who are more senior, that I think it's our responsibility to to force that process in a different direction.
Yes, Amber.
Charles, as you talk about the emphasis on numbers of publications, I think about that also when Casey, you asked originally kind of the gap between how institutional efforts move forward and then how those who are suffering want to see those changes. And one of the things that I think we struggle with is we want to see change in numbers, which are important, right? Like more students of color, more BIPOC students, but there's also when we look at data in the aggregate, right? Each data point is a story, it's a person. And as we move toward change to have more people represented in the field, what can we do to also think about the quality of the numbers, right? What are the quality of the experiences of BIPOC students as they're moving through our major, as they're going into grad programs and starting early tenure track careers or clinical careers. We like to count things a lot. And what is it? There's a saying that everything counts, but not everything can be counted, right? And so thinking about the quality of articles, the quality of experiences, the quality of the impact, I think is really important. We can't lose sight of that.
One thing
sorry, go.
One thing I just wanted to add to that is when you start to look at the quality of those experiences right now, and I hate social media, but social media gives us an opportunity to hear those experiences, to see them, to see the impact, and to be able to respond to them, to be responsive to them. I think we spend way too much time responding to them in terms of the communication piece, but being responsive to them, recognizing what those experiences are, what's lacking, what's missing, what we need to do differently, and then actually just going and making those changes. So that you asked earlier about how institutions need to do this, and to tack on to Robert's comment about strategic planning, there's an element of change management that is critical here. We have a sense of urgency, which is the first step in that change. So we've been given that gift. Now that we have that, it's simply a matter of trying to find those things that are going to demonstrate that we care, that this matters, that we can be successful. What are those what is the low-hanging fruit? Where can we put some things in place immediately? And then work on those deeper structural issues where we have to take things apart and put them back together in a new way. And if you think about it as a train track, there is a set of tracks that, you look off into the distance. Eventually those train tracks look like they come together. So you've got those short-term things you're working on, you've got the long-term things you're working on. Eventually that comes together and you've got that alignment, but the track keeps going. So it never ends. So you just got to keep working through that process.
This reminds me of the conversation that I've had with Teresa about change management. It's a well-studied discipline. It would be so good if all of us know it's the urgency, but there are ways, strategies to execute change. And I just want to touch on the review. Peggy, I think, at the grant review stage, senior scientists needs to speak up, especially when we think about judging grants with diversity aspects in there. I don't think all reviewers are necessarily educated enough to be actually giving out grant reviews with the correct lens. So I think we have a long way to go. But I think there's hope. On the hopeful note, I'm looking at 114. I want to be respectful with the captioner's time. So we're going to place a stop here. I hope that this is only the beginning of the conversation. Balancing conversation and action, I think, is what we're facing next year. And I wish you all the best to execute towards social justice with the best of intentions, knowing that it will be messy, but also give each other's grace to move forward. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.